Now we'll need to connect our Authenticate with Biometrics function to the UI. So let's go to our login view, and we will add an on-tap gesture for the Face ID button as well as the Touch ID button. So let me simply change my target to iPhone 13 instead. So let's add the on-tap gesture modifier to our Face ID button. So when the user taps on this button, we want to call our authentication manager .authenticate with biometrics. However, if you remember, we coded this function asynchronously. So right now we have an error that says that we have an async call in a function that does not support concurrency. In other words, the on-tap gesture modifier only accepts synchronous code, and we are trying to add an asynchronous code here. So if we add the await keyword in front of this function, we will still run into another error that says that we cannot pass function of type async to parameter expecting synchronous function type. To fix this, we simply need to wrap our function in a task.init closure. So let's move this function inside of it. And you can see that we don't have any error anymore. So let's simply copy this on-tap gesture and paste it on the Touch ID button. You might be wondering why we don't add the on-tap gesture to the Login with Credentials button. As this is the fallback for when biometrics authentication isn't available, it doesn't make sense to call the Authenticate with Biometrics function on-tap gesture of it. We'll need to create another function for Credentials login. We'll take care of that later on. But first, let's test out our Authenticate with Biometrics function. Let's go back to our Authentication Manager, and inside of the Authenticate with Biometrics function, we will print the value of is authenticated after setting it. So we'll print a string that says is authenticated and we'll print its value. Remember that since we're inside of a closure, we need to add the self right before calling the variable. Now, build your application in a separate simulator and not in Xcode's preview, and we'll need to test out the Face ID or Touch ID. If you build on iPod Touch or a device that doesn't support biometrics authentication, change it to one that does allow it. The simulator comes with a built-in feature where you can run Face ID or Touch ID with a matching or a non-matching Face or Touch ID. To enable Face ID in the simulator, click on Features, Face ID, and on Enrolled. Make sure you see the check next to Enrolled. In the same menu, you can see that we have a matching face or a non-matching face. In the simulator, click on the Login with Face ID button, and if you don't see anything happening, stop and build your application again. If it's the first time that you build your app, you should see an alert that asks you to allow the app to use Face ID. So click on OK, and you should see the Face ID pop up. So let's click on Features, Face ID, and Matching Face. And now the Face ID pop-up disappears, but if we go back to Xcode, we can see in the console that is authenticated is true. Now let's try to log in again, but with a non-matching face. So let's click on Login with Face ID, and let's go to Features, Face ID, non-matching face, and the face has not been recognized. Let's click on Cancel, and you can see the alert that we coded before, saying that we have an error, and the error is that the authentication has been canceled. So let's click on OK, and you can see that we fall back to a login with our credentials. So let's take care of the login with credentials process. In a full-fledged app, you typically connect your application to an external authentication system like sign in with Apple, sign in with Google, or any other authentication system. However, as we want to keep this tutorial short, we'll create a dummy function to authenticate a single user. You can learn how to implement a Firebase authentication service in the SwiftUI application in the Firebase Auth section of the SwiftUI Advanced Handbook. You can find this link in the text content of this section. In Authentication Manager, we will add a new function right below the Authenticate with Biometrics. And this function will be called Authenticate with Credentials, and it will accept two arguments. The first one will be a username, which will be a string, and the second one will be a password, which will also be a string. The only credentials accepted in this application are Stephanie for the username and 123456 for the password. So let's check that if the username dot lowercase is equals to Stephanie and the password is equals to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then we'll authenticate the user. So is authenticated will be true. Else, we will set the error description, which will be wrong credentials, and show alert will be true. Remember that this is only a dummy function and you wouldn't want to hardcode the credentials in your codebase in an actual application. Now let's create another view under the views folder. Let's create a new file and it will be a SwiftUI view. This view will be called credentials login view. Then let's click on create. Inside of this file, we will need a form when Face ID and Touch ID are not available. So at the top, let's add an environment object called Authentication Manager, and it will be of Authentication Manager type. Remember to add the environment object and create a new instance of the Authentication Manager for the preview. Next, we'll also add two states at the top. The first one will be called username, and it will be an empty string. The second state will be called password, and it will also be an empty string. For the contents of this view, let's remove the text hello world and add a VStack with some spacing of 40 pixels. Inside of this VStack, we will add our title, then we'll add a text field, and the text field will be a username with the text, which will be $username. And this is the binding value that we pass to this variable so that we can save what the user inputs in our username state. So right now you can see that since our title is white and our text field is also white, it's hard to see what's on the preview. So let's just add a frame with a max width of infinity and a max height of infinity. And let's also add some background color. So let's go to our login view, copy the background color that we added to our VStack, and then paste it in our credentials login view. So right now you can see our authenticator and our text field has a transparent background. We'll add a modifier called text field style, and it will be a rounded border field. And we'll also add some padding all around it so that it doesn't hug the sides of our screen. Next, we'll create a secure field, and this will be used for our password, meaning that what the user inputs in this field will be hidden. The text will be a binding value and it will be our password state. Right below our secure field, let's add our primary button, and the show image will be false. The text will be login. On tap gesture of the primary button, we want to call our authenticate with credentials function that we created in our authentication manager. So let's add the on tap gesture and we'll call our authentication manager dot authenticate with credentials. The username will be the username state that we created in this view, and the password, you might have guessed it, is the password that we created in this view as well. Now let's go back to our login view. On tap gesture of our login with credentials button, we want to lead the user to the new credentials login view. So we'll use the navigation link. Since the navigation link only works when our app is wrapped in a navigation view, let's go to content view and we'll wrap our entire VStack in a navigation view. So what we can do is click on Command on the keyboard and then click on our VStack, and we can embed this in either HStack, VStack, or ZStack, it doesn't matter. And we'll change this HStack to a navigation view. Now let's go back to our login view, and we will need to wrap our primary button for the default case in a navigation link. So navigation link, and the navigation link has two closures. The first closure is the action and the second one is the label. So let's move our primary button inside of the label closure. The destination of this navigation link will be our credentials login view. Remember to add the environment object modifier to not run into a crash later on. Now let's change our simulator to an iPod Touch and build our application in the simulator. And we'll need to test out the code for login with credentials. But first you can see that the text on our button is blue when it should be black. And when we click on that, Usually with the navigation link, we can see a back button here. However, since the default accent color is blue and our background is also blue, we cannot see the back button. So let's fix that first. In Xcode 13, to change the accent color, we will need to click on our Assets folder and then click on Accent Color. Then let's click on Universal and let's open the right panel. Under color, we will be able to change our accent color. So let's change it to label color, which is black, and let's build our application again. And now you can see that the text on our button is black, and if we click on that, the back button is also black. We can now authenticate the user with the username and the password that we hard-coded in our application. So let's add Stephanie and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for the password. And if we click on login, nothing happens. So now it's time to take care of the screen we want to show the user when they're logged in to simulate a login and logout flow. We want to keep the logged in screen simple, so let's go back to our content view and we'll need to add an if statement inside of the VStack. So let's add an if and we'll check if the authentication manager.isAuthenticated value is true. If it's true, we will want to show a signed in view. Else we will show our login view. So let's move the login view inside of the else statement. If the user is authenticated, we will add a VStack with some spacing of 40 pixels. Inside of this VStack, we will add a title as well as a text that will say welcome in. You are now authenticated. Let's change the foreground color of this text to white. And let's build our application in the simulator. So let's click on Login with Face ID. And in the menu at the top, I will select a matching face. And now you can see that I have my screen. However, my screen is all white, so we don't see anything. To fix that, let's go to our login view and copy the background as well as the frame. And go back to content view and add these two modifiers to the VStack inside of our if statement. Now let's build and run our application another time. And let's click on Login with Face ID, and I will select a matching face, and you can see that we're now logged into our application. However, now that we're able to log in, there is no way to log back out and go back to our login view. So let's create that function. Let's go to our authentication manager file and we'll create a logout function. So right below the authenticate with credentials function, let's create another one called logout. And this function will be really simple. We'll simply set the is authenticated back to false. Now let's go to content view, and right below the subtitle, we will add a primary button with the show image value, which will be false, and a text that says logout. And on tap gesture of this button, we will call our authentication manager.logout. Now build your application on your phone or on the simulator one last time, and we'll test out the complete flow of our application. So let's click on Login with Face ID, and I will select a matching face, and you can see that we're now logged in and authenticated. If we click on Logout, it will log us out of our application. So great! You finished coding the login and logout process using biometrics authentication. In this tutorial, we'll learn how to build an authentication process with Face ID or Touch ID. And we added a fallback to log in with credentials if both biometrics authentication types aren't available or the Face or the Touch ID has failed. We also coded a simple login and logout flow. Of course, there's a lot more we can do to make this app even better, like implementing an actual authentication service with either signing with Apple or signing with Google or even Firebase Auth. Now go ahead and build amazing authentication flows with biometrics in your SwiftUI applications.